Hi, welcome to the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America Virtual Book Fair Boston edition. We'd like to thank the fair sponsor, Michael's Insurance. Michael's Insurance has over 40 years experience providing fine art insurance and is devoted to protecting owners of fine arts, rare books, and antiquities against financial loss. Learn more at michaelsinsurance.com. Today's special program is the Harvest Festival. My name is Nicole Reese, and I'm a bookseller, a member of the ABAA, and chair of the Boston Book Fair Committee. For those of you who are not aware, the ABAA was founded in 1949 to promote interest in rare and antiquarian books and book collecting, and to foster collegial relations. We strive to maintain the highest standards in the trade. All members agree to abide by the ABAA's Code of Ethics. Following this program, we hope you will consider visiting the virtual book fair at abaa.org/bbf. It is continuously open until 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Saturday, November 20th. A few housekeeping issues. We are recording this session and it will be available at a later date on the ABAA's YouTube channel. If you have questions, we encourage you to move your computer cursor to the bottom of the screen and write your question in the Q&A section. The ABAA headquarters team will help us with those questions at the end of the session. If you would like to share a comment with all in attendance, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panelists of the Harvest Festival. And our panelist is Heidi Herr. As the Student Engagement Librarian for Special Collections, Heidi Herr creates programs and learning activities that engage Johns Hopkins students in conducting research with primary sources. She is also the librarian for English, philosophy, and the writing seminars. Heidi teaches courses on a wide variety of topics, including the ephemera of the women's suffrage movement and the development of the cookbook, and oversees the Sheridan Libraries Freshman Fellows Program. She holds MA degrees in English and Library Science from the University of Maryland, College Park. Thanks, Heidi. Take it away.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and just checking, make sure you can see my screen and you can hear me. Okay, great. Again, my name is Heidi, and I am delighted to be here with you today. And while I'm not a specialist with all things Harvest Festival, I do know a little bit about the history of Thanksgiving food traditions, especially through the lens of cookbooks. So I will be sharing with you today some of the cookbooks we have in special collections and discussing a bit about what they reveal about the development of the Thanksgiving tradition in America. And I will also be pointing out some of the cookbooks that were selected for purchase by students at Hopkins. One of the things that I love to do with undergraduates, especially freshmen, is teach them how to be curators and to make sure that their voice and their interest, and in some respects, their kind of personal history is represented in our collection. And it turns out that students, of course, love cookbooks, and they really love seeing their immigration story or their family's food traditions reflected in historic library collections. So I hope you enjoy this presentation, a cookbook cornucopia. So here we go, away we go. And of course, we can't really talk about Thanksgiving foods, foodways, what have you, without acknowledging the first Thanksgiving. And I don't know about all of you, but I realized that having attended Catholic school, they really taught us nothing at all about Calvinist traditions or kind of like the first Thanksgiving in general. All we really did was make construction paper turkeys. That's all I remember. My whole entire knowledge about Thanksgiving is based on how to create a construction paper turkey by tracing the outline of my hand. That is it. So of course, this news for many of you is probably old hat. But in terms of what we do know about Thanksgiving, it started as a 3-day-long harvest celebration held in autumn 1621 at Plymouth Plantation. We know that the Pilgrims didn't really consider it to be an actual Thanksgiving festival. According to Calvinist theology, there were special meanings involved with days of fasting and humiliation versus days of Thanksgiving. We know that there were a couple of firsthand accounts, but they don't really tell us much about what happened. We know that members of the Wampanoag tribe attended. We know that there were deer, that there were turkey, that there were fish, and there were recreational activities. But we also too know that a lot of this history was hidden until the 19th century, until the mid 19th century. And then, of course, Thanksgiving as an American tradition is also very complex. So while it was something that was celebrated continuously in New England, a sense of Thanksgiving, festivities, of holidays, of gratitude, it was something that really didn't become an annual federal holiday until 1870. We also, too, of course, have certain advocates through the years who really wanted to see Thanksgiving become a thing. And of course, we have Sarah Josepha Hale, noted Thanksgiving fetishist and editor of Godey's Lady's Book, who really advocated for Thanksgiving for decades, to the extent that she wrote a novel containing an entire chapter on the Thanksgiving dinner that reads something like, if, Suetonius had a super wholesome sister who, instead of writing about, the decadent ways of the Roman emperors, focused on the feasting traditions of New England housewives of the 19th century. It is really intense, full of meats and food, and you're just reading this like, what is going on? It is indeed wild. But we also too have this idea of the role pop culture played in the creation of the Thanksgiving myth. So we had advocates like Sarah Josepha Hale looking at Thanksgiving as this important thing for gratitude and patriotism and unifying the nation. But then you have all this imagery involving, turkeys and pumpkins and Puritans and Native Americans. But so much of this visual imagery and these symbols were not popularized to any extent until the early 20th century. So it's a very interesting and very long history. It's very complex. It takes all these twists and turns, which is why I'm happy that I can focus on what cookbooks tell us as opposed to doing a deep dive into the ways and means of Thanksgiving and how it became the holiday that we have today. So of course, when looking at the history of Thanksgiving in terms of what people ate, there's certain, classic Thanksgiving fare that's a given. Things like turkey, stuffing and gravy, and cranberry sauce, potatoes, carrots, and parsnips, apple cider, and a variety of pies. But the question, of course, is how did we get there? How did these foodstuffs become a traditional Thanksgiving meal? And this is where the George P. Library comes in. I really never thought fully about the history of Thanksgiving, giving the history of why we ate certain things in America in November, until I brought students into the George P. Library, which is one of the special collections libraries of the Johns Hopkins University. I was teaching a mini course on the history of the library, and as part of the course, students had free reign to go into the stacks, which is something that never happens. And they were able to really investigate the shelves, see what type of books were there, and pull them off the shelf, read them, and look at the history, look at the provenance, really try to figure out why these books were there. And the students were absolutely enchanted with the small section we have in the library, which is actually right here on the 5th floor in this little alcove, of historic cookbooks dating from the 18th century to the mid 19th, a mixture of English and American cookbooks. And I never before saw students really embark on conversations before around their books. They felt immediately at ease looking at cookbooks. They recognized, the format. They understood what a cookbook was, what it did. They noticed that some of these cookbooks were clearly saw life in the kitchen, so they didn't feel as though they were going to in any way harm the book. They felt ownership with these things, and they just enjoyed reading the books, laughing at some of the recipes that they thought were absolutely hilarious or strange, but then also taking absolute delight in seeing that some of the recipes that were documented in these cookbooks, even recipes dating back to the 18th century, were things that they enjoyed eating today. And it was really from that student interest and engagement with the collection that I was like, we need to build on this collection. We need to expand upon it. We need to incorporate various voices and histories into this collection because it's something that really appealed to students. So of course, as you all know, when we're looking at cookbooks, there's certain things that we need to consider. We need to look at the big four, who wrote it, who was the intended audience, where and when was it produced, and why it was written. And then after we answer those questions, think more fully about who was expected to do the labor. What type of ingredients were needed? What type of tools? Who could afford to make these recipes? Were these aspirational or were these things meant to be practical? And of course, looking at the cookbook as an object to get a feel for whether or not it was meant to be a collector's piece or something that was actively used in the kitchen. So all these things are the types of conversations that I would have with students. And hopefully we can have some of these conversations later as we look at some of these materials and what they reveal to us about Thanksgiving foodways. So enough, let's get cooking. So one of the books I always start showing students whenever we're talking about historic cookbooks, regardless of the theme, is Gerald's Herbal. And the copy we have at the Peabody Library is the second edition from 1633. And I like to show this book, even though it's not a traditional cookbook, to students because it fits their ideal of a rare book. The binding is this beautiful kind of like crackled calfskin. The book is huge, it's got heft to it, and it's full of illustrations, and it has, like the fracture typeface. So it really kind of meets what students expect to see when they have the sense of an ideal kind of old book. It almost looks like something from, like Harry Potter, right? They automatically know that this is old and it's kind of special. And students really love seeing the illustrations, but then reading about the various virtues and properties. So I often have them try to find the tomato, which of course in the parlance of the day was called an apple of love. And they then kind of look at the various properties and they realize that in addition to having illustrations and talking about where these foods grow and what they are good for, they also too have these like mini recipe suggestions. And for, the tomato, it's saying that it's kind of like a proto salsa. So they immediately relate and respond to this text. But it also is saying that it opens up various conversations about why a book like this was created. Really kind of thinking about this need to document plants, both from the old and the new worlds, and thinking about what this means in terms of empire building and colonization, the sense of trying to figure out what new world plants could thrive in the old world and what old world plants could be harvested and made for propagation and use in the new. So it allows us to have these critical conversations and really kind of think about food networks and how what happened in the 15th and 16th centuries really shapes the way we eat today. So I thought it'd be kind of fun to look at a few of the kind of typical like Thanksgiving things that we eat today and what this herbal from the 17th century tells us. So we have the secret life of the parsnip. So apparently the parsnip is really great because not only does it provoke urine and lust of the body, but it's also good for the stomach, kidneys, bladder, and lungs. And students, of course, upon hearing about how eating the parsnip promotes lust of the body, want to go out and buy some parsnips. What can I say? These students are highly imaginative. And we also, of course, have documentation of the sweet potato, a New World crop. And what students find fascinating about this is that the way people talk about the preparation of the sweet potato, it's similar to what we do today, that they're used to be eaten roasted over ashes and people flavor them to taste with oil, vinegar, and salt. And then again, for their properties, this idea that they comfort and nourish and strengthen the body, but yet they also, again, procure bodily lust and greediness. And then, of course, we have the great American pumpkin, which is a beautiful, beautiful illustration. But the pumpkin you must eat with great care because the pulp of the pompion or the pumpkin, if improperly, mixed or cooked, or perhaps added with apple, doth fill the body full of flatulence or windy belchings, and is food utterly unwholesome for such as live idly. But unto robustus and rustic people, nothing hurteth that filleth the belly. So again, this idea that, you're looking at this pumpkin, you're like, oh, this is really cool. Like, I recognize this. This is something that we have every Thanksgiving. But then you're like, wait, what? People were really concerned about the pumpkin because it promoted, it could cause gas. So again, I'd like to think that introducing students to some of the ingredients that we have, the produce that we have during Thanksgiving, it provides and provokes great conversation during Thanksgiving dinner, which is something that as librarians, we really want to promote. Good, hearty conversations. So we kind of see in England that there's a lot of conversation about, kind of foodstuffs and food products in America. So it should be no surprise that a lot of what we consider to be classic Thanksgiving fare are foodstuffs that were introduced in England, that were promoted in England. Turkey, for instance, roasted turkey. Turkeys were sent to America in the 16th, were sent into England in the 16th century. So when we look at these cookbooks, it is often surprising to students to find, as early as the 18th century, recipes for like roasting and preparing turkeys. And what we have here is a cookbook that was selected for purchase by a student, The Whole Duty of a Woman from 1737, which was meant to be not just a cookbook, but a guide in life to young women, telling them how to be, proper virtuous virgins, how to be good, strong wives, and how to be, remarkable widows who can also cook a great roast. And this book, of course, is something that provides a lot of conversation among students because they look at it through the lens of gender, like wondering what was an ideal woman meant to be in the 18th century according to this book. So of course, as a virgin, you're meant to hold all men with suspicion. And as a wife, if your husband was a drunkard, and apparently we were assured that our husband would one day take to the drink if we were married, we were basically told to deal with it. And that if we were lucky, our husband would be a happy drunk who would view all of our faults as being wonderful, wonderful virtues. And if not, don't worry about it. It's our cross to bear. But though this conversation about what the whole duty of women was, it's interesting to is very, of course, sexist and misogynistic and highly, highly, highly outdated. We can look at it today to learn a little bit about how people were incorporating American foodstuffs into the English diet. And here we have a rather crude but charming illustration showing how to prepare a turkey for a roast. And, we are given instructions to pick your turkey, draw it and singe it neatly, cut the liver of it into bits and put it into a stew pan, together with a dozen of oysters and a bit of butter, and then, seasoned with a variety of, things like herbs and onions and whatnot. And what we see here most so interesting is this use of oysters with turkeys, because this is something that we'll see time and time again in 18th, 19th, and 20th century cookbooks that produced for the American diet. This idea that you need to incorporate a lot of oysters with your turkey, oyster stuffing, oyster sauces, you name it. So we're seeing this in these English cookbooks. And we also, too, find out that people never ate turkey legs, which students, of course, are shocked by because students love going to Renaissance festivals and eating those humongous turkey legs. So this idea that people didn't eat turkey legs because they were eating a different type of turkey than what we are, used to getting at the grocery store absolutely amazes them. Because to students, the turkey legs are the best part of the turkey. And this idea that you wouldn't eat them, that you would toss them, was just, too much for them to take. And also looking at this recipe, we see some words that students don't know, like chibble, which are like small onions. And then, of course, this idea of bards. And we're not talking about Shakespeare. So people aren't like putting like Shakespearean, wrapping their turkey in Shakespearean, plays and poems and whatnot. Instead, they're wrapping their turkey in bacon to help preserve the moisture. So a simple recipe like this really makes students think about the need to consult dictionaries and things like the Oxford English Dictionary to figure out what is going on. And then once they can decipher this recipe, they realize that certain means and ways of preparing the poultry, it's similar to what they do today, or what they see, their family members do today when making Thanksgiving dinner. So we also, of course, have in the later 18th century, this tradition continuing of English cookbooks documenting ways to cook, American foodstuffs. And here we have Elizabeth Raffold, who, wrote The English Housekeeper. And our edition from the Peabody Library is from 1786 and includes this illustration of her passing along her knowledge to the reader. And Elizabeth Raffold's recipes were meant to be simple, tasty, and economical. They were very popular, and she wrote her recipes with a great deal of respect to the women who were supposed to make them. She didn't patronize them or talk down to them, but rather treated them as though they were her friends. They were respected, and that they would know what to do with her recipes. And we see, of course, within her cookbooks, a variety of recipes for turkey, including this recipe for how to boil turkey in in an oyster sauce. And this recipe is something that students are shocked by because they're not thinking about the fact that people would actually have to kill their Thanksgiving turkey or their turkey roast in order to eat it back in the day. So the recipe starts with, let your turkey have no meat the day before you kill it. When you are going to kill it, give it a spoonful of agar or vinegar. It will make it white and eat tender. And when you have killed it, hang it up by the legs for 4 or 5 days at least. And when you have plucked it, draw it at the rump. So you have all this prep work involved before you even roast the turkey, that you are meant to slaughter it. And the students too, when they're analyzing this recipe, they try to figure out all the ingredients that they need, because of course, unlike standard recipes that we have today, there's no ingredients list or no kind of cooking time. There's no like list of apparatus that you need to roast the turkey. They also too find it fascinating that you're expected to garnish the turkey with like lemon and barberries, with barberries being something that's similar to cranberries in the English diet. And yet again, the turkey legs, the sacred turkey legs, are once more thrown out. So again, this idea that students are reading an English cookbook from the 18th century that has this very kind of familiar way of prepping a turkey, it really and truly blows their minds. And we then see, of course, that we have a standard kind of market day, like when things are available at market. And they see that it turns out for the month of November, it was a prime time to buy turkeys, but it was also a prime time to buy carrots, turkeys, parsnips, and potatoes. Again, this traditional Thanksgiving fare. So this idea that what people were eating in November in England is very similar to what people were eating in America. Again, this kind of similarity between like food networks and foodways and culture is something that students really, reflect on, and it draws forth a lot of, kind of conversations, crucial conversations regarding what we eat and why we eat it. So of course, these cookbooks didn't just stay in England. So these cookbooks made their way to America. And at the Peabody Library, we have an 1801 edition of The Experienced English Housewife, which makes no it doesn't really have anything that's unique to the American diet. It's simply a reprint of the 12th edition. So while we do have, American cookbooks being published with Amelia Simmons' first cookbook in 1796, English cookbooks were exceptionally popular and were considered still to be the standard. So once we kind of understand that people were reading and cooking from English cookbooks, students have a greater understanding that this is why Thanksgiving dinners look the way they do. It's because of this Anglo-Saxon culture and the cookbooks that were available and what people were familiar cooking and preparing, and also who they viewed as authorities, who they wanted to learn from. And those were all, again, kind of crucial, thinking about the notion of authority. But eventually, more and more American cookbooks populated the market, and we begin to see more of an acknowledgement of American foodstuffs and American foodways. So another cookbook we have at the George Peabody Library is The Cook's Own Book from 1832. And it was the first original cookbook written in America that followed an encyclopedic format. And while the content was influenced by 18th century cookbooks, it still kind of addressed some needs of what an American cook would need to know. And one of the things that we love about this cookbook is that there's a note on the sandwich. And as everyone knows, you have so much turkey left, you want to make sure that your sandwich is really, really, really good. So we have an observation on sandwiches, and we find that sandwiches properly prepared, an elegant and convenient luncheon or supper, but have got out of fashion from the bad manner in which they are commonly made. To cut the bread neatly with a sharp knife seems to be considered the only essential. And the lining is composed of any awful odds and ends that cannot be sent to table in any other form. Whatever is used must be carefully trimmed from every bit of skin, gristle, etc., and nothing introduced but what you are absolutely certain will be acceptable to the mouth. And those indeed are words to live by. And due to time, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but I do want to look at some of the recipes that we see in Godey's Lady's Book, which of course was edited by Sarah Josepha Hale. And these are recipes that were printed after she left the editorship. These are recipes from 1879, but it shows like the full array of what was expected to be at a Thanksgiving banquet by the late 1870s, after Thanksgiving became a national federal holiday. And it's just full of rich, rich fare, tons of oysters, tons of turkey, tons of cranberry, just tons of meat, and of course, the ever important sandwich. And apparently, you're supposed to add some tongue or ham to give your turkey sandwich some added and much needed zest. And seeing, Thanksgiving really become this like important national holiday, a day of pride, we begin to see Thanksgiving mentioned in the White House cookbook. And again, too, it's a very kind of rich, rich recipes, much like what we see with the menu with Godey's Lady's Book. You start your day with a porterhouse steak, then you have a turkey, then you have a chilled cold roast. It's all great. It's all good. It's super great with tons of pumpkin pie. And you also have, the official White House way to carve the turkey. And apparently, when you serve it, according to like White House etiquette, you give a mix of light and dark meat, but you do not eat the turkey leg. So even again in 1912, this idea that the turkey leg is verboten remains. And looking again at these menus with the New England Thanksgiving dinner, we see the Boston Cooking School cookbook. Again, looking at from 1918, the menu is still consistent and the same, this idea of eating lots of turkey, having oyster soup, your Thanksgiving pudding, and tons of pies. But what's interesting about this particular cookbook published in 1918 is to begin to have photographs. So you have a recipe that tells you how to roast turkey, but you're now, you can add some flair. So this is a roast turkey garnished for serving with carrot garlands. You can see here some sliced carrot as a garland around the turkey, along with some parsley and other things. So it's a way of making your turkey beautiful. So you can read the recipe, look at the photograph, and try to recreate what you're looking at. So again, kind of like printing technology, changing the way we can view Thanksgiving, elevating the bird, making Thanksgiving dinner slightly more aspirational. And going along with that aspiration, of course, would be centerpieces. And here we have from the Boston Cooking School cookbook, a centerpiece that's cut out of a pumpkin or a large gourd, filled so as to make your own cornucopia with bananas, grapes, and apples and other things. This idea of showing like the fruit of the harvest, the fruit of the nation. So celebrating all the great things you can get in America around the table. So many of these cookbooks that we had looked at briefly, they were from, the English perspective, and they were largely written by white women or for a white audience. So one of the things that I was doing with my students, we decided that we needed to really look at new voices, new experiences in cooking, and new traditions. So many of the cookbooks that we're looking at right now are cookbooks that were bought through this like student curatorial project I created. So we're going to really see the student voice and student research interests through this section. So a cookbook we recently bought, and again, this was a student-driven acquisition, is What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Southern Cooking from 1881. And this cookbook was written by a woman who was formerly enslaved. And this cookbook was printed by a women's co-op in San Francisco in 1881. And this cookbook, of course, is just this phenomenal example of social history. And it was also an example of the oral tradition. So Mrs. Fisher could not read or write. She was an expert, well-trained chef, but she could only get her recipes out there through the oral tradition. So women, she actually, she spoke her recipes and women typed them out. And we have here a recipe for circuit hash, which is actually succotash. And it's a recipe involving like tomatoes and butter beans and corn. And for our own Thanksgiving dinner that I had growing up, we actually had a succotash dish that was very similar to this so-called circuit hash in What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Southern Cooking. And we also begin to see some differences with how to prepare turkey. So again, this idea of bringing in other food traditions and also to a sense of regionalism into how we eat, moving away from this like classic New England fare. And for her boiled turkey, she talks about adding some cayenne pepper to it, to season it and to make it nice and spicy. And this is something that we did not see in these like more traditional, kind of like Anglo-Saxon versions of classic Thanksgiving supper. We also begin to see this aspect of regionalism. So we have a Maryland and Virginia cookbook, which moves away again from doing everything the New England way. So you begin to see mock turtle soup, like a very kind of regional favorite in Maryland. You also begin to see this idea that you need to have platters of tomatoes at your meal, that they are needed at Thanksgiving. Because of course, like the Chesapeake Bay region is known for kind of creating like really, really excellent tomatoes. And I also had to laugh looking at this recipe because looking at the menu for Thanksgiving dinner, because it involves tons of champagne. You drink champagne, then you bake your ham in champagne. It's champagne everywhere. Everyone gets champagne. I have to admit, having lived in Maryland my entire life, I have never once been to a Thanksgiving dinner that incorporated champagne so heavily, but one can only dream, I suppose. So we have, regionalism. We have this idea of people who do not come from this Anglo-Saxon background contributing to what we know about Thanksgiving and how we can make a delightful Thanksgiving feast. We also begin to see the scientific voice we're in, really looking at issues of nutrition. So this is the American Home Diet from 1920, which really kind of meant to change the way Americans eat, to be more mindful and to make sure that we were eating as healthfully as possible. The subtitle to the American Home Diet is "What Should We Have for Dinner?" The eternal question, and we all feel that, right? And it was written by two Hopkins trained doctors, including Evie M. McCollum, who was instrumental in determining the importance of vitamin A and the vitamin B, conglomerate into how we eat. So the purpose of this cookbook, which was donated to the Peabody Library by the Baltimore Dairy Council, because allegedly Evie McCollum, the co-author, was in the pocket of big dairy, was to find ways to get people to eat more leafy greens and to consume more dairy as part of a well-rounded diet, and to aid in childhood nourishment and childhood development, and to create and to make sure that children had fewer diseases that were associated with vitamin deficiency. So they would kind of give you several different Thanksgiving options based on what you could afford. So if you couldn't afford a turkey, well, maybe you could have a nice roast chicken. Maybe you couldn't afford oysters, but maybe you could have a nice boiled squash. So really trying to really maximize what your vitamin intake to make sure that even during holidays, you weren't just kind of eating very decadent food, but you were really and truly eating a nutritious, wholesome diet. And we have also this intersection of like regionalism and race come into play with the New Orleans cookbook from 1940. And this is another student-driven acquisition. And this was written by Lena Richard, who really received who aside from attending the Fanny Farmer School in Boston, really like learned how to cook while a teenager employed as a domestic. And her talent in as a cook was widely acknowledged and seen, to the point that by the 1940s, she had her very own like television show in New Orleans, which is a wild and wonderful achievement. And again, it kind of shows how looking at these cookbooks, all these hidden histories are revealed. And we realize just the vast contributions that people have made in America to how we eat, and how unfortunately so many of these legacies are forgotten. But through the New Orleans cookbook, we're introduced to a delightful sliced turkey sandwich, which incorporates both, a well-made sandwich that we know was super important to the cook's own book and to Godey's Lady's book. But we also too see this idea that in addition to having your sliced turkey, you add some sliced ham and some sliced tongue, a tradition which dates back to the 18th century. We also see through the New Orleans cookbook kind of the standardization of certain Southern cuisine as part of a wider Thanksgiving fare. So again, we have, succotash, which I always remember having as part of a Maryland Thanksgiving, but we also have, of course, some boiled green corn and corn pudding. So again, this expansion of what a Thanksgiving dinner should and could mean to a diverse America. And we also begin to find the incorporation of Thanksgiving foodways in unexpected places. And this is another student-driven acquisition, How to Cook and Eat in Chinese, the second edition. Last year, I worked with a student who was interested in APITA cookbooks. And we realized that we really didn't have a whole lot. So we spent an entire year working together to curate a collection. And this was one of the cookbooks that he really wanted us to acquire. And we did. And it was a very kind of famous, important mid-century cookbook that really helped to popularize and legitimize Chinese cooking in America. And one of its importance, of course, was that it adapted traditional Chinese recipes to the American diet, really kind of considering the type of kitchen apparatus most Americans had, as well as what Americans could feasibly buy at an American, supermarket or, through like various kind of like regional smaller marketplaces. But there was also a tip of the hat to things that Americans expected to see in a cookbook. So we end up having, believe it or not, two recipes for turkeys, for like roasting a turkey and salting a turkey in a Chinese way. And the author of the cookbook takes great pains to remind people that the turkey is not indigenous to China and that there's no like genuine, kind of Chinese turkey recipes. But if you want to, create a Chinese inspired Thanksgiving, you can do so by prepping the turkey using certain seasonings and certain sauces that were used for Chinese fowl. And again, it's just like a delightful surprise to see these like elements of Thanksgiving in a Chinese cookbook written for an American audience. It just really was wild. And when the students saw that, he just could not believe that. And I think it was something that he wanted to try himself. And I need to follow up with him to see if he and his family were going to try this upcoming Thanksgiving. And this idea too of thinking about authority and who has the authority to write about cooking and Thanksgiving and and these various ideas of who has the privilege and who has the knowledge and expertise. All that is blown away with one of my favorite things we have in our collection, A Date with a Dish, which is by Frida de Knight, who was the first culinary editor at Ebony magazine. And this is the very first cookbook that was really written with an African American audience in mind. And it's such a charming and incredible cookbook. And it was meant to kind of expand the notion of what African American cooking is, away from like the Southern regionalism that we saw with What Mrs. Fisher Knows about Southern cooking, to incorporate recipes like from Trinidad, recipes from Africa, recipes from the entire African diaspora. So it was meant to really kind of widen and appreciate African American contributions to American cuisine. And she has, a suggested Thanksgiving menu, which has items that we haven't seen in other cookbooks of the age, such as avocado and crab meat cocktail, cornbread dressing, and an eggplant casserole. But one of the things too that I really adore about this cookbook, and which I find just like so charming and so relatable, is that she interviewed people and incorporated their recipes into her cookbook. And she also uses the cookbook as a way to memorialize people who influenced her. And when I was looking at various recipes she had for turkey, I just could not believe that she had a recipe from a man from Baltimore, an African American named Charles Shipley, who was an exceptionally famous caterer. And he was someone who really like mentored her while she was learning about cooking and really kind of trying to become a professional in the field. And she wrote of him, to see men like him, without benefit of cooking schools and college education, accomplish such great things should be an everlasting inspiration to every housewife. And one of her absolute favorite recipes from him that he gave to her was this recipe for a turkey salad, which is something that you could do with a freshly made turkey, or you could use your turkey leftovers to create. And she included it because she really wanted Charles Shipley's legacy to live on, and as a way of giving gratitude to him, giving thanks to him, and remembering him, at Thanksgiving dinner. It really is just such an incredible, incredible story. But we also, of course, so we have these ideas of like regionalism and ethnicity and widening the net of who owns, in a sense, Thanksgiving away from just this very kind of narrow white New England sphere. We also, of course, have to think about the counterculture. And one of my most favorite cookbooks is the Alice's Restaurant Cookbook from 1969, which is this really fun kind of hippy dippy approach to cooking with so much joy and fun. And just, I really, it's one of those few cookbooks that you can read from cover to cover. The photographs are fun and engaging. And she, just has jokes throughout. So she really is a big fan of sweet potato pie. And indeed, she's basically telling everyone, stop with the pumpkin pie. Pumpkin pie, everyone does it. Make sweet potato pie. And she goes, I think this leaves pumpkin pie sitting in the road. So it's just a very kind of fun way just approaching food with fun and joy and whimsy. I think we all need that during the stress of Thanksgiving. And I know we are running a bit out of time here, and I've been talking, but I would be remiss if I didn't address the vegetarian Thanksgiving, because we have a lot of students at Hopkins who are interested in vegetarian diets. And I'll just talk about two of these. The first being the cookbook that students love the most in our collection, the Golden Rule Cookbook, which is really a straight up like vegan cookbook. And students find this fascinating because what is talked about in this cookbook in relation to vegetarian cooking is basically the same thing that we talk about today. This idea that we shouldn't eat meat because of labor practices, because of questions of like humane treatment of animals, and really thinking about the brutality and what we are consuming. And the author of the cookbook, Mrs. R.L. Sharp, she was a debutante, but she also too was this kind of great inspirational figure, and she was very, very popular. She was known for wearing, like fake leather and fake fur and really kind of popularizing this sort of fashion. And she also really strove to popularize a vegetarian Thanksgiving, which involved a lot of like a fresh mushroom cocktail, a Michaelmas loaf, which was a nut-based loaf, tomato salad, and cranberry punch, a lot of different things. But she also was not a fan of mock meats because she felt that mock or fake meat was abominable because it basically made people think about eating animals. And we kind of see this too today with some people really not liking things like the Impossible Burger, because we should not be thinking about the burger as a concept at all. And she kind of subscribed to that. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to get to my experiment in historic cooking. So I recently purchased a suffrage cookbook, and it does have Thanksgiving related recipes. One thing was a nut turkey for suffragists, a nut turkey instead of the national bird. And I was just like, what incarnation are they talking about? Because I never once thought of stuffing as a sculptural form. But here we go. We have the nut turkey for Thanksgiving instead of the national bird, made by mixing 1 quart of sifted dry breadcrumbs and walnuts and all of that. But then I was like, oh, this sounds disgusting. But then I knew I had to make it. I had no choice but to do this because of the sentence. Then form into the shape of a turkey with pieces of macaroni to form the leg bones. And I was like, I want to do this. I want pieces of macaroni to form leg bones. And so I did this. I constructed the vegetarian nut turkey. It smells great, but tastes abysmal. It actually smells like stovetop stuffing. So here you have it, the nut turkey. Make it for your own Thanksgiving table, or just get a lot of stuffing and form it into the shape of a turkey carcass or a Bob Ross head or whatever you want to do. It may not be a taste sensation, but it sure beats, the Boston Cooking School weird centerpiece of bananas inside a pumpkin. So there we go, the nut turkey in all of its full glory with its, macaroni noodle for bones. Yes, it is, of course, weird. And with that, I want to thank you for your time during this like rambling journey of Thanksgiving foodways. And I really do look forward to your questions, and my apologies for going a bit over time.
Thank you so much for this incredible presentation. I'm very hungry now, and I imagine other participants are as well. So if you have a question, feel free to either put it in the chat or in the Q&A box. And it looks like we have one now. Can you please speak to the influence of French cooking on Thanksgiving trends, as it was so prevalent in the 20th century?
And I have to admit, that is something that I really have not looked at all yet, in part because the French cookbooks that we do have in our collection are, well, written in French, and I can't read French. But a lot of our focus with kind of like building out the collection really had been looking at kind of like immigrant communities and really kind of expanding, like moving away from kind of like the European voice. So this is an area where unfortunately I can't speak to it, but I'm sure there has to be a strong connection, especially in terms of thinking about like roasting meats, roasting vegetables, like the use of butter and fine pastries. So clearly there has to be a connection. We also too know that there are many celebrity French chefs who made their way into New York City, who were part of like the restaurant scene and who became quite prominent and were aspirational and wrote cookbooks that were printed in America for their audiences. So there's definitely a connection, and you just gave me something that I really want to explore. And my apologies, I can't speak more fully to it.
Thank you. Someone would like to know what course the students were in and what majors, your courses are comprised of.
Yeah, so I taught a course, it was called Cooks and Their Books. And it was sponsored through our university's Museums and Society program. And I taught it several times. And what absolutely delighted me about it was that the students were from all majors, including from the School of Engineering, which is kind of unheard of from a humanities perspective. And the students who approached the cookbooks with a more scientific mind were really into trying to figure out what these recipes meant, especially the earlier recipes. And one of the really great things that happened is that one of the students in public health realized that many of these cookbooks were talking about like the healthful properties, like what we saw with Gerald's herbals. And she became very interested in looking at cookbooks, both in print and manuscript form, to trace the development of like cures for rabies. And I mentored her in a special collections fellowship where she spent the entire summer really looking at these special collections resources. And this was the first time we had someone from public health really do a deep dive into our rare materials. And she told her friends about the collection. So we ended up having all these 6 students from the School of Public Health stopping by to look at these cookbooks. And that was really fun. I think the charm of it really is that students see themselves reflected in these recipes because, everyone loves food. And by kind of expanding the collection to incorporate other voices and other traditions, it makes them feel part of kind of like the university in a way that they didn't when, they think of special collections just as being, the works of like great white men and women. It really makes them relate and want to study the materials.
Yeah. And I think also how the materials speak to the general public and not just, people who could be in universities and stuff. So someone would like to know what kind of budgets the students had for purchasing these books.
Right. So I opened this up a couple of times and I basically carved out a relatively small budget from my budget funds. And I'm not comfortable sharing the amount, but it was reasonable. So basically, for the most part, what students were suggesting for purchase was under $500. And I didn't purchase everything because of, like budgetary concerns, but I basically had students do research. I gave them some, I kind of like set them hip to some, ABAA members, I sent them your way to look at your websites to see what was available. And I basically had them make an argument for why this item should be ingested into the collection. So kind of thinking about, well, does this address a gap in our collection? Or does this enhance, an area of highlights? And students are really, really, really into it. And from this, we began to acquire everything from, Jello pamphlets, because students are just obsessed with Jello, to a lot of cooking material that shows the development of kind of Chinese cooking in America. And that was as well as like Indian cooking too. Those have been areas of huge interest among our student population.
Yeah, and it's also probably super, well, you mentioned the Chinese cooking around Thanksgiving, but also, how they've influenced different holidays.
Yeah.
And if it's, the same dishes being prepared for Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, whatever holidays, or if they differ based on what's available at that time. Wonderful. Any last minute questions, feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A. But thank you so much. Let's see. It's fascinating to see the course of human history through cookbooks and how food was prepared, seasoned, and served. And that's true. We're putting it into our bodies. It's going to have an output. So that's really wonderful. Thank you so much for being here with us, Heidi. This was a really wonderful panel, very educational. And someone mentioned in the chat the all of the drawings in the books, which were really beautiful. So thank you so much, everyone. Don't forget to visit the book fair, abaa.org/VBF. And if you scroll up in the chat, there's links to cookery, a few Thanksgiving specific items, and feel free to browse. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.